The high desert air outside Santa Fe was still and clear, shimmering with midday heat. From her car, parked on a dusty overlook, Clara Reed had a perfect, panoramic view of the sprawling adobe compound below. The sanctuary of eternal light, with its lush, irrigated gardens and pristine white walls, looked like an oasis of peace. But today, it was a scene of methodical chaos. A swarm of black SUVs and federal agents in tactical gear moved with silent, overwhelming efficiency, their red and blue lights flashing silently against the serene landscape. She watched as they led a man out of the main building. Even from this distance, she recognized the charismatic figure of Julian Voss, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. This, she knew, was the fall of a king. But it was the next person they brought out that made her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. A woman, fighting and screaming at the agents, her face contorted with a righteous fury. Clara didn't need binoculars. She knew that face better than her own. It was her mother, Eleanor Reed. The same woman who had supposedly died peacefully in a Swiss clinic 2 months ago. The same woman whose funeral Clara had been in the process of planning. Clara's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, her expression unreadable. How did a daughter, consumed by grief for her dead mother, become the architect of this magnificent ruin? And why, at the very center of it all, did her dead mother look so furiously, so impossibly alive? The answer began 18 months earlier, with a phone call that shattered Clara's meticulously constructed world. It wasn't a lie that felt like malice, it was a lie that felt like a tragedy. One moment, Clara was a rising architect in a prestigious Chicago firm, her drafting table overlooking the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. The next, she was listening to her mother's voice, thin and laced with brave tears, describe a rare, aggressive cancer. The doctors in Santa Fe had given her months, Eleanor whispered, but there was a sliver of hope, an experimental clinic in Germany offering a radical new therapy. The unspoken plea hung in the air between them, heavier than any skyscraper Clara could ever design. Her father was gone, her mother was all she had left. The fear of being truly alone was a cold, sharp-toothed animal in her gut. There was no decision to be made, only an immediate, instinctual reaction. Within 48 hours, she had resigned from her job, sacrificing an upcoming promotion. She broke the lease on her apartment, packing the life she had proudly built for herself into cardboard boxes. She drove 1,000 miles from a city of steel and glass back to a town of earth and sky, her mind numb with a singular, desperate purpose: to save her mother. She unpacked her bags in her childhood bedroom, the floral wallpaper seeming to mock her return to a life she thought she had outgrown. At the time, she believed the only price of this battle would be her time and her career. She had no idea that was just the opening bid. The opening bid was her career, the next was her entire net worth. The demands for payment began a week after her arrival, disguised as sterile. Official emails from the Klemper Institute for Cellular Regeneration. They were filled with complex medical jargon, phase 1 cytokine therapy, mitochondrial transfusions, and concluded with staggering 5-figure invoices. The first one required a wire transfer of $150,000. Clara sat at her childhood desk, the one where she used to do her homework, and watched the entire savings she had painstakingly built over a decade disappear with a single click. It was the down payment for a future she was now sacrificing. But the emails kept coming. For the next phase of treatment, she sold her car, the reliable sedan that had carried her life from Chicago. For the phase after that, she started taking on freelance architectural drafting jobs, working late into the night after long days of caregiving. Through it all, Eleanor played the part of the brave, wilting patient to perfection. Her moments of profound weakness and pain always seemed to coincide with the arrival of a new bill. She would hold Clara's hand, her own feeling frail and cool, and whisper, "I know this is hard, my love, but I can feel it working. You are saving my life." Those words were the fuel. They made every sacrifice feel not like a loss, but like a holy act. Clara was now broke, exhausted, and living on fumes of hope. She was giving everything she had. It was a dangerous position to be in, because there was still one thing left to give. The last thing left to give was the house itself. The quiet, adobe-style home her father had built, its walls holding the echoes of every happy memory she possessed. The final demand came disguised as a tearful, hopeful breakthrough. Eleanor, looking more frail than ever, presented Clara with a glossy brochure for a private wellness sanctuary in Montreux, Switzerland. They were pioneering an experimental stem cell therapy, she explained, a final, definitive cure. It was her last chance. The price was $300,000. The number was so vast it seemed unreal, but the implied alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. To refuse felt like signing her mother's death certificate. That night, Clara walked through the empty rooms, her hand trailing along the rough-hewn wooden beams her father had set in place. Selling the house felt like a betrayal of his memory, like tearing out the last pages of her own life story. But her mother's life felt infinitely more precious than wood and plaster. She found a cash buyer, a developer who made a quick offer, and signed the papers in a state of numb grief. The wire transfer left her bank account a hollowed-out shell. She had now sold her career, her savings, her car, and, finally, her past. As she drove her mother to the airport for the trip to Switzerland, Eleanor squeezed her hand. "You saved me," she whispered. Clara was left alone, in a rented apartment, surrounded by the silence of a life stripped bare. The battle was over. All that was left was to wait for her mother to come home healed. The waiting ended 3 weeks later, not with a joyful reunion, but with a sterile, transatlantic phone call. A man with a crisp, vaguely European accent, identifying himself as Dr. Alleman, informed her that the stem cell therapy had been too aggressive for Eleanor's weakened body. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news was a physical blow, sucking the air from Clara's lungs and the light from the world. It was over. All the sacrifices, the money, the career, the house, all of it had been for nothing. Her mother was gone. The deep, primal fear of being utterly alone, the fear that had driven every decision she'd made for the past year, was now her reality. Days passed in a fog of hollow grief. She finally forced herself to begin the grim task of sorting through her mother's belongings for a memorial service. She opened the bedside table, expecting to find the grim artifacts of a long illness: prescription bottles, appointment cards, stacks of insurance paperwork. But the drawer was empty, save for a stack of glossy pamphlets for a place called the Sanctuary of Eternal Light. The serene, smiling face of its leader, a man named Julian Voss, beamed up at her. Confused, she checked another drawer. More pamphlets, and a book written by Voss. In the closet, tucked into a shoebox, she found not hospital bracelets or medical records, but donation receipts made out to the sanctuary. There was nothing from a doctor, nothing from a hospital, nothing to prove her mother had ever been sick at all. For the first time, a question colder than grief began to form. What, exactly, had she been paying to fight? The fight, she had assumed, would end with a funeral. That became the first of her many assumptions to unravel completely. She called the kind, solemn funeral director who had handled her father's service years before, asking him to arrange the international transport of her mother's body from Switzerland. He promised to make the necessary calls. When he called back 2 days later, his voice was laced with a professional confusion that did little to hide his concern. "Clara, I've been in contact with my counterparts in Montreux," he said slowly. "They've checked with the cantonal authorities and the city morgue. There's no official record of Eleanor Reed's passing. There's no record of her even being admitted to a hospital there." A cold spike of fear pierced through her grief. It must be a bureaucratic error, she told herself, a delay. Her hands trembling, she dug out the number the so-called Dr. Alleman had called from. She needed to hear his voice, to get the paperwork, to make this real again. She dialed, pressing the phone hard against her ear. There was no ring. Just a crisp, automated voice. "The number you have dialed is not in service. Please check the number and try again." She hung up and dialed again. And again. The result was the same cold, digital dead end. The professional sympathy was gone, replaced by a void. Her mother hadn't just died, she had vanished. The money hadn't just been spent, it had disappeared into thin air. Alone in her quiet apartment, Clara understood. This was no longer a tragedy. It was a lie. And she couldn't face it alone. The only person she could call was Ben Carter. He was a childhood friend who had traded the sleepy sunshine of Santa Fe for the cynical grind of investigative journalism in Denver. His inherent skepticism, Clara felt, was the only antidote for the poison of lies she had swallowed. After she recounted the impossible story over the phone, her voice cracking with a mixture of grief and panicked confusion, he was on the road. He listened to the whole story again in her apartment, his expression growing grimmer with every detail. He didn't offer condolences, he asked for data. Bank statements, emails, the pamphlets. For hours, the only sounds were the clicking of his keyboard and Clara's ragged breathing. Finally, he turned the laptop towards her. The picture he had uncovered was horrifyingly clear. The Montreux Wellness Sanctuary was a shell corporation, registered to a P.O. box and dissolved a week ago. But the money hadn't vanished in Switzerland. Ben had traced every wire transfer. All $450,000 had been funneled directly back to a U.S. bank account under the name Sanctuary of Eternal Light. The truth, ugly and distorted, began to crystallize in Clara's mind. So he found her when she was sick and afraid, she whispered, her own theory feeling like a gut punch. This, Julian Voss, he preyed on her, sold her a fake cure, and took everything. Her mother had been a victim, lured into a predator's web and left to die, penniless and alone. It was a monstrous thought, but it was the only one that made any sense. The theory made perfect, tragic sense to Clara, but to Ben's journalistic instincts, it was a story full of holes. He gestured to the stacks of books and pamphlets piled on the coffee table. "Clara, look at this," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "These aren't the belongings of a simple victim. This is the library of a devotee. If Julian Voss was just scamming her, why would she be studying his teachings like a disciple?" Clara pushed back, her voice defensive. She was sick, Ben. She was desperate and vulnerable. She would have clung to anything. But Ben shook his head, pressing on. Then why the elaborate fake death? Financial predators bleed their marks dry and disappear. They don't orchestrate complex international death hoaxes. It's too risky, there's no reason for it. He was right. The sheer theatricality of it was what felt so wrong. Ben opened his laptop again, navigating to a slick, professionally designed website. "Predators like this crave an audience," he murmured, clicking on a link titled Live Streams. "They aren't hiding. They're recruiting." The page was filled with dozens of videos, sermons, testimonials, celebrations. He pointed to a thumbnail at the top of the page, uploaded just 2 days ago. "If we want to understand what happened to her, we need to see the world she was living in." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The idea of seeing her mother on screen, alive and vibrant from a time before she died, was almost too painful to bear. But Ben's logic was a lifeline in her sea of confusion. With a trembling finger, she reached out and clicked play. The video began with a sweeping, cinematic shot of the sanctuary's main courtyard, bathed in the golden light of a New Mexico sunset. Hundreds of people, all dressed in flowing white, sat enraptured as Julian Voss took the stage. He was handsome, charismatic, his voice a hypnotic balm as he spoke of transcending earthly pain and releasing the attachments that bind us to suffering. As he spoke, the camera panned slowly across the adoring faces of his followers. Clara scanned the crowd, her breath held tight in her chest, searching for a ghost. She was looking for a glimpse of her mother from months ago, a face that might have been captured before the illness had taken its final toll. The camera settled on the front row, reserved for the most devout, the inner circle. A woman looked up at Voss, her eyes shining with an ecstatic, fervent adoration. Clara's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. This woman was the picture of health, glowing, vibrant. "Pause it," Clara whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Ben froze the frame and zoomed in. There was no doubt. The slight tilt of the head, the familiar line of her jaw, the small mole beside her left eye. It was Eleanor Reed. In the bottom corner of the screen, the video's timestamp was a brutal, undeniable fact. October 4th, 2025. 2 days ago. More than a month after she had supposedly died in Switzerland. The grief, the fear, the confusion, it all vaporized in an instant, replaced by a single, horrifying truth that burned away everything else. Her mother wasn't a victim, she was a volunteer. And the cancer wasn't a disease, it was a script. And she, Clara, had not been a caregiver. She had been the unwitting sole investor in the most intimate and cruel piece of theater imaginable. The past year replayed in her mind, but the footage was now grotesquely recolored by the truth. Her mother's frailty after a long day of treatment was an actress's calculated exhaustion. The tearful gratitude each time Clara handed over more money was a performer's closing scene. Every pained smile, every whispered word of hope was a line from a script designed to extract the maximum possible sacrifice. The entire illness was a fiction, and her mother had given the performance of a lifetime. The money hadn't been for medicine, it was a tribute. Her life savings, her car, the very house her father had built, it was all just an extravagant offering to a charlatan, a buy-in for her mother to secure a place in the inner circle of a cult. The faked death was the most vicious cut of all. It was not a tragedy, it was a business transaction. It was Eleanor's way of severing the final tie to the daughter she had just bankrupted, allowing her to be reborn into her new, enlightened life, free of charge and free of consequence. The daughter who had cried herself to sleep for a dying mother was gone, incinerated in the fire of this new truth. In her place sat someone else, someone colder and sharper. The woman who now stared at the frozen image of her mother's smiling, treacherous face was not planning a memorial. She was planning a war. War was declared not with a scream, but with the quiet, deliberate click of a laptop closing. The grief that had hollowed Clara out was gone, replaced by a glacial, diamond-hard focus. Ben, sitting opposite her, was pale with a mixture of shock and journalistic fury. "This is the most diabolical, twisted con I have ever seen," he said, his voice low. "They didn't just defraud you, they psychologically tortured you." Clara simply nodded, her eyes still fixed on the screen where her mother's treacherous smile was frozen. "The money is gone, Ben, I accept that. Getting it back isn't the point." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not his grieving friend, but a stranger. "They used my love to build their paradise. I'm going to use the truth to burn it to the ground." Her apartment, once a place of mourning, became a command center. Her mind, once trained to design buildings, was now repurposed for demolition. She saw the sanctuary not as a group of people, but as a compromised structure, and she began looking for its load-bearing walls. "Every cult, every fraud, has a foundational lie," she said, her voice even and methodical. "We find that, and the whole thing comes down." Their plan was simple in its objective: total annihilation. Ben would attack from the outside, digging into the cult's finances and history. But Clara knew she had to find a way to attack from within. To do that, she had to understand the origin of the rot. Why had her once rational mother fallen for this man? The answer, she would soon discover, was buried not in her mother's faith, but in her father's grave. The digging began with Ben chasing a simple question: when and how did Eleanor Reed first encounter Julian Voss? He spent days combing through old digital newspaper archives and public records, tracing the sanctuary's origins back to its founding a decade ago. Late one night, he found it. Not in a glossy brochure, but in a small, buried article from a local Santa Fe paper. The headline was innocuous: "Local attorney raises concerns over new wellness guru." The article quoted the attorney, who warned that Voss was a charismatic predator preying on the community's vulnerable. Ben's blood ran cold when he read the attorney's name: David Reed, Clara's father. He showed the screen to Clara, his face grim. The date on the article was from 10 years ago. 3 weeks before her father, a healthy, active man with no history of heart problems, had dropped dead from a sudden, massive coronary. The coincidence was too stark, too violent to be ignored. The truth hit Clara with the force of a physical impact. Her mother hadn't discovered the sanctuary in her grief. She had known about it, known Voss, while her husband was still alive. She had chosen to join the very man her husband had been trying to expose, the very man whose arrival coincided with his mysterious death. The last flicker of sentimentality for the woman who was her mother was extinguished. This wasn't just a story of fraud, it was a story that began with the desecration of her father's memory. And Clara's revenge would no longer be just for herself. It would be for him. Retribution for her father required more than a newspaper article, it required a confession from the serpent's own mouth. To get that, Clara had to become a predator herself. Over the next 2 weeks, she and Ben meticulously crafted a new identity. Catherine Blackwood was born a reclusive tech heiress from San Francisco, recently orphaned and adrift with an 8-figure inheritance. Ben built her a sparse but believable digital footprint while Clara rehearsed her backstory, channeling all her real pain into a fictional tragedy. She made an initial anonymous donation of $50,000 to the sanctuary, enough to get noticed. As expected, an invitation for a private consultation with Julian Voss himself arrived within days. She walked into his serene, sunlit office wearing a simple, elegant black dress and a tiny, audio recording brooch disguised as a piece of antique jewelry. She played the part of the perfect mark, intelligent but wounded, spiritually hungry and desperate for a father figure to guide her. "All this money, it feels like an anchor," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of brokenness. "I want it to mean something." Voss leaned forward, his eyes radiating a predatory empathy. "True enlightenment, Catherine," he purred, his voice a hypnotic caress, "comes from releasing the material burdens that keep us tethered to this plane. You must unburden yourself to ascend." He took the bait completely, outlining a scheme to transfer her fortune into a series of spiritually aligned trusts he controlled. He left the meeting energized, believing he had just landed his greatest prize. He had no idea he was her final target, and that he had just recorded his own death sentence. The execution of that sentence was delivered not with a bang, but with a click. In a sterile, rented office space in downtown Santa Fe, Clara and Ben initiated their perfectly synchronized attack. The day before, Clara had sat in a quiet room with 2 federal agents, her hands steady as she played the full, unedited recording of her conversation with Julian Voss. The agents listened intently, their expressions hardening as Voss's own voice laid out his predatory philosophy of spiritual extortion. That recording was the key, turning Ben's journalistic investigation into a federal case. Now, all the pieces were in place. Ben sat at his laptop, his cursor hovering over the publish button on his explosive, career-defining exposé. The article detailed the entire web of financial fraud, the psychological manipulation, and ended with a chilling, evidence-backed chapter questioning the convenient death of the local lawyer who had tried to stop Voss a decade earlier. Clara's phone buzzed on the table. A simple, one-word text from her FBI contact. "Go." Ben took a deep breath and clicked the button. The story went live. Within moments, the digital world erupted. News alerts lit up their screens as other outlets picked up the story. Number Sanctuary of Lies began to trend. The digital bomb had detonated, destroying Voss's reputation and his carefully crafted empire of lies from the outside in. And at that exact moment, miles away, the physical assault began. As the first federal agents breached the gates of the compound, the heaven built on the ruins of Clara's life began its immediate and irreversible transformation into a hell of consequence. The consequences arrived in tactical gear, shattering the sanctuary's manufactured peace with the hard, cold reality of the law. Julian Voss, stripped of his saintly robes and messianic aura, was reduced to a common criminal in a wrinkled shirt, led away in handcuffs while his followers wept in confusion. Eleanor was among the last to be escorted out. She was defiant, screaming at the agents about religious persecution, her face a mask of righteous fury. Her eyes scanned the chaos, and then, as she was being guided towards a federal vehicle, she looked up at the hills overlooking the compound. She saw a single car parked on the overlook, a lone silhouette in the driver's seat. The distance did nothing to hide the truth. She knew who it was. In that single, sickening instant, the entire trap sprung shut in her mind. The grieving heiress, the perfectly timed investigation, the raid, it all originated from that silent figure on the hill. Her daughter. The foolish, loving girl she had so easily discarded had become the architect of her doom. Eleanor's defiant rage crumbled, replaced by the silent, slack-jawed horror of absolute defeat. She had not only sacrificed her child for a fraud, she had personally forged her loving daughter into the instrument of her own destruction. She had created the avenger who now stood in judgment over her. Do you believe Eleanor ever truly loved her daughter, or was Clara always just a resource to be exploited? Share your final verdict on the mother in the comments below. A year later, in the clear, high-altitude air of rural Colorado, the dominant sound was not the ocean, but the clean, sharp noise of construction. Clara had taken the portion of her money recovered by the courts and bought a small, empty plot of land. On it, she was slowly, meticulously, building a small house of her own design. It was a structure of glass, steel, and honest, exposed wood, a fortress of transparency. Ben's article had won him a national award. Julian Voss was serving the first year of a 25-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy. The investigation into her father's death had been reopened, a cold case that remained stubbornly unsolved but was no longer forgotten. Her mother, Eleanor, had served 10 months as a co-conspirator before being released on probation. Clara had a restraining order. She had not heard her voice, nor seen her face, since the day of the raid. She wasn't happy, not in the way she had been in her old life in Chicago. That version of herself, the open, trusting, naive woman, had died in her apartment while watching that live stream. The revenge had not brought joy. It had brought a stark, quiet peace. It was the silence that comes after a controlled demolition. She had learned the full, terrible measure of her own capacity for coldness, and that knowledge was a heavy thing to carry. But as she stood on the subfloor of her unfinished house, looking at the blueprints she had drawn herself, she felt a sense of ownership she had never known. She was no longer living in a house built by her father or paying for a lie told by her mother. She was finally building on her own foundation, a foundation of hard-won, brutal truth. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt safe.